Hey there, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Scientists Free from Religion. On this podcast, we treat religion as a secular topic. We may cover, we may approach topics that are not directly connected to religion, but whenever religion come up on the conversation, religion will be treated as a secular and topic that should stand on its shoulder. We not treat religion as special. So if religion is good, it will be accepted as good. But different from the, let's say, the common sense, here religion is not treated as special. Generally, people like scientists or people in general, they tend to either treat religion as good. Most of the time they are religious people, but even agnostic and non-religious people, they tend to treat religion as a common good. So they tend to avoid the topic. And whenever they talk about religion, they tend to follow into the common trap, which is they tend to choose the most happy and the most, let's say, not confronting idea. So religion is treated in general as a common good. As one example, recently the Pope decided to get involved into artificial intelligence. I did a very big map. I scanned. I decided to take a look on what the media was saying. I found that most media found that the Pope, that was a good news that the Pope was interested in artificial intelligence. I believe it's the opposite. If you take a very close and very critical thinking perspective on the involvement, on the fact that the Pope got interested in artificial intelligence, the Vatican got interested in artificial intelligence, I think it's something that we should get worried. Most of the time when the Vatican, when the Catholic Church got interested in something, if you look in the past, if you look at the data, it's not good news. So welcome to this podcast. I'm very glad you are here. I hope we are going to have an awesome time together. I hope that you are going to learn a lot together. And I'd like to invite you to share, to leave your like. This podcast is available on several platforms, such as YouTube, Spotify. In general, I make it available in as many platforms as I can, as it's available as I can do. So I hope we have an awesome time together. So I hope you learn a lot from this podcast.
Imagine for a second right now that you're holding your smartphone. Just, picture it in your hand.
Oh, I'm sure most people actually are holding it right now.
Yeah, probably. And you've got this, miraculous little slab of glass and silicon and rare earth metals. And it translates ancient Greek in real time. It predicts global weather patterns. It tracks the actual electrical impulses of your heart.
Right.
And we're entirely comfortable, completely at ease with the idea that the scientific method, the engine of hypothesis and data and rigorous testing, that science can build this device, that it can map the human genome or launch telescopes to look at the birth of galaxies.
It's the standard. We expect it.
Exactly. But the second we pivot to the hardest, most fundamental questions of human existence, questions like what is good or, what is evil, how should we actually structure our societies? We just suddenly throw our hands up.
We do. We act like science has absolutely nothing to say.
Right. We treat human values as if they exist in this mystical separate universe where data and evidence just simply do not apply.
It's just this incredibly profound cognitive divide. We demand objective empirical truths in our engineering, our aviation, our medicine. But when we step into the realm of morality, society it largely accepts this murky relativistic fog.
Yeah, it's wild.
The prevailing assumption is just that science is officially permanently silent on the human condition and how we ought to live.
And questioning that exact silence is the mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring a completely paradigm-shifting argument, and we're grounding this in excerpts from Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. how science can determine human values.
It's a heavy one, for sure.
It really is. And to frame our analysis for you, the listener, we are directly channeling the editorial focus of Jorge Garapires.
Right, which is so crucial for this specific topic.
Exactly. His work operates right on that volatile, frankly fascinating frontier where science and religion intersect, or, more often where they violently collide.
It's a collide, yeah.
So our goal here today is to examine human values, origins, existence, entirely through the strict lens of scientific methods and secular reasoning.
Meaning no theological free passes.
Right. Within this framework, we are looking at religious traditions and cultural dogmas, not as unquestionable sources of ultimate authority, but as historical, psychological, and cultural phenomena. Things that can be and should be objectively analyzed and critiqued.
And it is definitely worth establishing right up front that the source material we're unpacking today pulls absolutely no punches.
Zero punches.
I mean, it sharply critiques the political left for sliding into moral relativism, and it equally targets the political right for clinging to religious dogmatism.
So just to be super clear with you listening, our role here is not to endorse any specific political or religious viewpoint. We're just impartially laying out the mechanics of the arguments presented in the text.
Right. We want to expose the underlying logic so you can evaluate the strength of the claims for yourself.
Okay, let's unpack this. To even begin understanding the premise that science can determine human values, we have to look at the massive philosophical wall that has blocked this idea for centuries.
A very stubborn wall.
Right. We are talking about Hume's guillotine, or the is/ought problem, which is named after the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume.
So Hume was operating during the Enlightenment, right? A period of massive intellectual upheaval. And he observed that writers would describe the physical world, how things are, and then suddenly, without any logical bridge whatsoever, they would just start making claims about how people ought to behave.
They'd just skip a step.
Exactly. They skip the most important step. Hume argued that you literally cannot deduce a moral ought from a factual is. Like, you can't look at the fact that humans are biologically capable of violence, which is an is, and logically derive a moral rule that we ought or ought not to be violent.
And that idea just became foundational. I mean, decades later, you had G.E. Moore expanding on it with what he called the naturalistic fallacy.
Right, the open question argument.
Yeah, Moore proposed that if you try to define a moral concept like goodness using a natural measurable property, so, for instance, defining good as whatever brings people pleasure, you can always logically ask, but is this specific instance of pleasure actually good?
Because maybe someone takes pleasure in doing something awful.
Exactly. And because you can always ask that question, Moore argued that goodness cannot be reduced to any physical, measurable phenomenon in the natural world.
Which leads directly to the modern consensus among, public intellectuals and scientists today. The text highlights thinkers like the philosopher Jerry Fodor, who really embodied this modern quarantine.
The firewall.
Right. The general consensus is that science describes facts, but it cannot prescribe norms. It can tell us the atmospheric composition of Jupiter, but it cannot tell us what is fundamentally wrong with the human condition or, how to fix it.
But I have to challenge that quarantine, because the source material brings a sledgehammer to this exact division. The central argument here is that the fact/value firewall is a complete illusion.
Yeah, total mirage.
Yeah. Harris proposes that values, at their absolute core, are simply facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. And just think about the mechanics of that claim for a second. If something does not affect the actual or potential experience of a conscious being in this universe or any other, how could it possibly matter?
It can't.
Right? What else could the word value actually mean if it's entirely disconnected from conscious experience?
And that right there is the pivotal pivot point of the entire book.
Mm-hmm.
If you tie value to conscious experience, you finally bridge the gap between is and ought.
Because consciousness is a physical reality.
Exactly. Conscious experience is not magic. It's a natural phenomenon. It emerges from the physical architecture of the brain, the intricate dance of neurotransmitters, and the interaction between an organism and its environment.
So it's measurable.
Yes. Therefore, if values are about conscious well-being, and conscious well-being is a product of physical reality, then values translate directly into scientific facts.
Yeah, let me play devil's advocate here for a minute. Because defining morality strictly as well-being makes a lot of philosophers incredibly defensive.
Oh, they hate it.
They really do. They'll argue that morality is about justice or fairness or, fulfilling some divine duty entirely independent of whether it makes anyone well.
Right.
But if we strip away the abstraction and just look at an extreme example, the logic really seems to force our hand here. Like, imagine a hypothetical universe where every single conscious entity is suffering the maximum possible agony.
Just absolute worst case scenario.
Yeah. The physics of this universe are literally designed to inflict inescapable, excruciating misery on everyone, forever. Now, if we cannot universally agree that moving away from that specific state of maximum misery is good, then the word good has been completely hollowed out.
It's meaningless.
It ceases to have any functional meaning in human language whatsoever.
And the author uses that exact logical anchor. If you concede that a universe of maximum misery is bad, and that navigating away from it is good, you have essentially admitted that moral truth is tethered to conscious experience.
You've crossed the bridge.
You've crossed it. The text actually uses this really fascinating thought experiment involving a hypothetical Adam and Eve to sort of scale this concept down. Imagine just two humans exist in the entire universe.
Okay.
There are objective, quantifiable facts governed by physics, neurobiology, chemistry that dictate whether their interactions will lead to mutual thriving or mutual destruction.
Right. Like if they decide to collaborate, pool their caloric resources and build a shelter against the elements, they are objectively moving toward a state of physical and psychological well-being.
Exactly.
And if they decide to turn on each other and just smash each other with rocks, they move toward misery. The distinction between those two states isn't a matter of subjective opinion, right? It is an objective reality of their biology.
And the extrapolation the author makes here is just so crucial. If there are objective facts about the well-being of two people, why would adding nearly 8 billion more people to the planet suddenly render morality completely subjective?
Right. The math gets way harder.
Oh, the variables multiply exponentially. The math becomes staggering, and the ecological and social interactions become infinitely more complex. But the underlying reality that there are factually better and worse ways to navigate human survival, emotional health, and societal flourishing that doesn't just evaporate because the equation got harder to solve.
Which perfectly brings us to the core metaphor used to visualize this vast, complex equation. The title of the book itself, The Moral Landscape.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to conceptualize all these intersecting variables of human experience?
So the moral landscape is presented as a hypothetical topological space of all real and potential outcomes for humanity.
Like a 3D map.
Think of a vast undulating terrain. The highest peaks of this landscape represent the absolute zenith of human well-being. So societies characterized by deep fulfillment, innovation, compassion, harmony.
In the valley.
The lowest valleys represent the deepest possible suffering: famine, chronic terror, torture, complete societal collapse.
And the idea is that our movement across this terrain, whether a society is actively scaling a peak or sliding down into a really dark valley, is determined by objective factors.
Yes.
It's determined by our cultural practices, our legal systems, our ethical codes, and crucially, how those systems interact with human neurobiology.
But, and this is where people get tripped up, the nuance here is essential. Acknowledging that this landscape exists doesn't mean advocating for some monolithic utopian dystopia where everyone is forced to live exactly the same way.
Right, like there's only one right answer.
The author is super explicit that there is no single peak. The landscape could feature thousands of different peaks.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon, so you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well a technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully in the future I'm going to write also about religion, atheism and science, but I do have a podcast, I do have a blog called the Scientists Free From Religion, the same name of the podcast, and you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion and atheism. So hope you enjoyed the show. So let's come back to the show.
I find the nutritional science analogy in the text incredibly helpful for understanding that.
Oh, it's a great analogy.
Like, if you look at human nutrition, it is obvious that there is no single universally perfect food that every single human being must consume.
We don't all have to eat kale 3 times a day.
Exactly. The culinary diversity across the globe is immense.
Yeah.
However, acknowledging that there are multiple healthy diets does not mean we just abandon nutritional science altogether.
Right.
It doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say, well, eating a balanced Mediterranean diet is just as valid a culinary choice as, drinking a glass of battery acid.
That is the exact mechanism of the argument. Just as there are boundaries to what the human body can metabolize without suffering severe damage, there are boundaries to what the human psychological and social architecture can actually endure.
Yeah.
There are multiple, perhaps totally incompatible ways for a society to thrive on a peak, but there are also objective valleys. And to really illustrate this, the text contrasts 2 highly generic but entirely plausible human lives.
The juxtaposition here is striking. First, consider what the author terms the bad life. Imagine a young widow living in a dense jungle during a protracted, brutal civil war. She has never known physical safety. She has never received an education. Her daily existence is completely defined by chronic hunger, parasitic infections, and just this cortisol-drenched terror of avoiding roaming militias.
Just constant survival mode.
Constant. And the absolute psychological apex of her suffering is watching her daughter be murdered by her own son, who was abducted and brainwashed by warlords to commit the act. Her brain is permanently locked in a state of relentless, inescapable trauma.
Now contrast that with the good life. Imagine a healthy, intellectually engaged philanthropist living in a stable democracy.
Worlds apart.
Literally. They are surrounded by a deeply loving community, they have a secure and stimulating career, and they have just been endowed with a $1 billion grant to cure a major global disease. Their neurobiology is just bathed in the neurochemicals of trust, reward, and deep social connection. The argument is that if you admit there is a meaningful, tangible difference between these 2 lives, and that this difference is rooted in the physical reality of human biology and environment, you have admitted that moral truth exists.
But let me push back on the boundaries of this.
Yeah.
Because someone looking at this framework might say, well, okay, that's fine for the average person, but what about a clinical psychopath?
Right.
What about a serial killer like Jeffrey Dahmer? From his subjective perspective, his good life involved kidnapping, torturing, and murdering victims. So if well-being is the metric, and his brain-derived pleasure from doing that, doesn't his mere existence prove that morality is inherently subjective?
The author completely anticipates this, and he applies a really rigorous standard from the hard sciences to resolve it. In literally every other domain of scientific inquiry, we inherently accept that certain opinions simply do not count. If an amateur astronomer walks into a NASA control room and insists that the moon is made of plasma and orbits the Earth every 3 days, the astrophysicists do not suddenly conclude that astrophysics is entirely subjective.
No, they call security.
Exactly. They recognize that this individual is a crank, and their opinion is just discarded.
Because they are objectively wrong about the data.
Precisely. And the text argues that the exact same boundary must be drawn in the realm of morality. There are moral experts, people who understand the deep mechanics of human flourishing, and there are moral lunatics.
Dahmer is a moral lunatic.
Yes, a A psychopath like Dahmer is simply objectively wrong about how to maximize human well-being on a global scale. His neurological aberrations cause catastrophic suffering for others. We do not have to accommodate the moral framework of a psychopath any more than a cosmologist has to accommodate the physics framework of a flat earther.
So if this landscape of peaks and valleys is tied to objective reality, and if the difference between a thriving society and a collapsing one is this biologically obvious, how did we get here?
That is the big question.
Why are so many brilliant, highly educated people seemingly blind to this? The text points to massive cultural and political blind spots that have effectively crippled both the secular left and the religious right.
Yeah, the separation of facts and values has created very distinct pathologies on both ends of the political spectrum. Let's examine the secular left first.
Okay.
The author argues that by systematically dismantling the concept of objective moral truth, the secular left has fallen into this paralyzing moral relativism. Driven by a desire for multiculturalism and a really deep fear of appearing imperialistic, they often adopt a stance of tolerance that paradoxically tolerates extreme intolerance.
Because they doubt that any universal moral answers even exist, they strip themselves of the intellectual foundation required to condemn the systemic cruelty of other cultures.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have the religious right. They firmly believe that objective moral truths exist, but the text argues they believe it for entirely the wrong reasons.
Right. They anchor their moral truths not to the biological reality of human suffering, but to the dictations of a divine creator recorded in ancient texts.
Which creates an incredibly rigid dogmatism. It results in a worldview that prioritizes scriptural literalism over the actual scientifically observable causes of human misery. They aren't navigating the moral landscape based on the actual terrain. They're walking around blindly based on a map drawn thousands of years ago.
The text provides highly specific, really illustrative examples of how these blind spots manifest in the real world. Like looking at the right-wing blind spot, the author points to the United States, where corporal punishment in schools remains legally permissible in 21 states. Today, we are talking about educational institutions legally authorizing adults to strike children with wooden paddles hard enough to cause deep bruising and real physical trauma.
Which, when you look at the developmental neuroscience, is just staggering.
It is entirely backwards.
It is. The justification for this practice is overwhelmingly rooted in religious tradition specifically, biblical interpretations like spare the rod, spoil the child. But if we evaluate this through the lens of the moral landscape and empirical science, the data is just unequivocal.
Total.
Subjecting a developing child to physical pain, chronic fear, and public humiliation is catastrophic for their neurological and emotional development. It correlates with higher rates of aggression, anxiety disorders, antisocial behavior. Yet, the shield of religious dogmatism creates this massive cultural blind spot that protects this actively harmful practice from actual scientific scrutiny.
And the left-wing blind spot is just as rigorously critiqued. The text traces this back to the early 20th century history of anthropology, focusing on figures like Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict.
The pioneers of cultural relativism.
Exactly. In their effort to push back against the horrific legacy of colonialism and eugenics, which is understandable, they heavily promoted cultural relativism. They fostered an academic environment where judging the practices of another society was viewed as like the ultimate intellectual fin.
The prevailing wisdom became that you can only seek to understand a culture on its own terms. You can never, ever evaluate it.
Which creates a scenario where highly educated individuals perform these incredible mental gymnastics to avoid condemning obvious atrocities.
Right.
The text highlights the Albanian tradition of the Kanun. Under this ancient social code, if a man commits a murder, the victim's family is culturally obligated to seek revenge by killing any innocent male relative of the murderer.
It's just a cycle of blood.
Yeah. You have generations of boys and men living as virtual prisoners in their own homes. They can't go to school. They can't seek medical care because the moment they step outside, they are legally marked for death for a crime they had absolutely nothing to do with.
It's unimaginable.
Or consider things like female genital mutilation or the forced veiling of women under the threat of acid attacks. The strict moral relativist observes this and says, well, who are we to impose our Western values? That is simply their culture.
And the author's counterargument is that we are human beings equipped with brains capable of understanding the biological and psychological causes of suffering. We have an intellectual and moral obligation to identify that those cultures are trapped in a very deep, very dark valley on the moral landscape.
But let me introduce a challenge here from evolutionary biology.
Bring it on.
If a cultural practice, even one that seems incredibly brutal, like blood feuds, survives for hundreds or thousands of years, doesn't that imply it has some evolutionary utility? Like, if the society practicing it hasn't gone extinct, doesn't that suggest the practice is somehow adaptive? Or at least working for them on some level?
That is a very, very common defense, but the author dismantles it by leaning into the critical distinction between genes and memes.
And just to clarify for the listener, we are not talking about internet memes here. We're not talking about cat pictures.
No, definitely not. We are utilizing the concept of the meme as originally defined by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. A meme is a unit of cultural transmission, an idea, a belief, a ritual, or a behavioral practice that replicates and spreads from human mind to human mind.
Okay.
Genes are biological replicators. They're constrained by physical reproduction. Memes are informational replicators. And the key insight here is that a cultural practice does not have to be physically or psychologically beneficial to the human host in order to survive. It simply has to be highly effective at replicating itself.
So a bad idea can literally act like a virus.
Exactly. A society can be deeply infected by memes like the belief in witchcraft, the necessity of blood feuds, or totally irrational dietary taboos that actively diminish the physical health and emotional well-being of the population for centuries. Like, a meme that threatens non-believers with eternal torture, for instance, is incredibly good at replicating because it completely hijacks the brain's fear centers. Just because a harmful cultural practice survives does not mean it is evolutionarily beneficial to the humans practicing it. It simply means the meme hasn't managed to kill off its host species entirely yet.
This is where the deep dive gets incredibly fascinating. Because to truly understand why human beings are so susceptible to clinging to harmful memes and dogmas, we have to look under the hood.
We have to look at the brain.
Exactly. We have to move past anthropology and philosophy and dive directly into the neurobiology of belief. How does the human brain physically process a value?
The text argues forcefully that morality is not a mystical domain, but rather it's just an undeveloped branch of science. And the fundamental bridge connecting facts and values is the mechanism of belief. The human brain basically functions as a relentless engine of belief. We are continuously absorbing, processing, and integrating information about the world that we assess to be true.
And the critical revelation here is that the physical architecture of the brain does not appear to draw a hard, compartmentalized distinction between a factual belief and an ethical belief.
No, it doesn't at all.
Right. The author points out that holding the factual belief that water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, and holding the ethical belief that torturing children is wrong, they share the exact same logical and neurological properties.
Yes.
When you state that something is morally good, you are not merely expressing an aesthetic preference, like saying, oh, I prefer the taste of chocolate. You are making a definitive claim about reality. You're asserting that you are of sound mind, you have evaluated the evidence, and anyone else situated in your position should logically agree with you.
And what makes this argument so compelling is that modern neuroimaging provides the empirical data to actually back it up. The author details functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI studies, that look specifically at how the brain processes belief.
What do they show?
Well, when researchers observe a brain evaluating the truth of a mathematical equation, and then they observe that exact same brain evaluating the truth of a moral proposition, they see activity in the exact same neurological systems.
That's crazy.
Specifically regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The brain's machinery for assessing truth is completely unified. It does not possess a separate, isolated values processor. And because our moral values are intimately tied to these observable physical brain states, science is perfectly positioned to study and evaluate them.
To understand how deeply this biological connection runs, the text explores the neurobiology of early childhood development. It demonstrates how environmental values and cultural practices literally, physically construct the brain.
The mechanisms here are just profound. We know from neuroendocrinology that human social attachment, emotional bonding, and the regulation of stress are heavily governed by specific hormones, primarily oxytocin and vasopressin.
Right, the bonding hormones.
Yeah, these neurochemicals are the biological foundation of trust and empathy.
And the author highlights this deeply affecting study involving orphans. Researchers examined children who spent their critical early developmental years in state-run orphanages environments that were characterized by severe emotional neglect, a lack of physical touch, and just profound social deprivation.
Heartbreaking environments.
Truly. They then compared the neurological profiles of these children to children raised in traditional, nurturing home environments. And the biological divergence was stark.
Extremely stark. The researchers measured the concentration of these crucial hormones in the children's blood. When the children raised in nurturing environments interacted physically with their mothers, their systems exhibited a healthy, robust surge of oxytocin and vasopressin.
Right, it's the biological signature of a secure bond.
Exactly. However, the children who endured the severe deprivation of the orphanage system completely failed to produce that normal hormonal surge when interacting with their adoptive mothers.
It is a devastating data point.
It reveals the actual biological cost of our environments. The chronic stress of severe neglect essentially downregulates the brain's receptors. It proves that cultural norms, institutional practices, and the ways we treat each other are not just abstract ideas floating around in the cultural ether.
No, they have physical consequences.
They are physical forces that alter the epigenetic expression and structural wiring of the developing human brain. Our moral environment literally dictates our neurochemistry.
Applying this neurological lens fundamentally changes how we view political and moral disagreements, too. The text dives into the research of Jonathan Haidt, who is a prominent moral psychologist.
Right, very well known.
Yeah, and Haidt's data suggests that people on the political left and the political right operate using genuinely different moral frameworks. According to his research, liberals primarily base their moral judgments on two foundations: harm and fairness. Conservatives, however, utilize those two, but they add three additional foundations: respect for authority, purity or sanctity, and strong in-group loyalty. And Haidt often uses this to argue for a form of moral pluralism, suggesting we just have different, equally valid moral taste buds.
But the author of our source text pushes back really hard on Haidt's interpretation. Harris analyzes the mechanisms beneath those conservative traits, authority, purity, loyalty, and argues they are not actually separate, independent moral foundations at all.
Oh, really? Where are they?
Instead, they're simply different culturally conditioned anxieties about harm. And critically, he points out how deeply these specific traits are driven by the brain's evolutionary propensity for the emotion of disgust.
Disgust is such a primal, visceral emotion.
It really is. It's rooted in regions like the insular cortex, which originally evolved to protect us from pathogens and spoiled food, right?
Keep us from eating rotten meat.
Exactly. But in human beings, this biological pathogen avoidance system has been completely hijacked by cultural memes to police social boundaries. When you analyze conservative moral judgments, particularly those concerning non-traditional sexual norms or outgroup behaviors, they correlate heavily with physiological markers of disgust.
Wow.
The author's premise is that just because different populations have different neurological sensitivities or culturally amplified disgust triggers, it does not mean both frameworks are equally valid on the moral landscape. If a morality heavily driven by disgust leads a society to systematically oppress or inflict violence on a minority group, science can objectively evaluate that outcome and state that this neurological framework is less conducive to global human flourishing.
So if human values are this intrinsically tethered to brain states, and if the empirical data regarding well-being is becoming clearer and clearer, why is the broader scientific establishment so hesitant to lead this conversation?
It's baffling.
Why do brilliant scientists bend over backward to pretend they cannot speak with authority on morality? Which brings us to the collision at the frontier between science and religion.
The author posits that there is an irreconcilable zero-sum conflict between the scientific method and religious dogma. They represent fundamentally antithetical methods of interrogating reality.
Oil and water.
Pretty much. Science relies on continuous, open-ended inquiry, the willingness to falsify hypotheses, and a strict demand for empirical evidence. Religion, as structurally defined in the text, relies on dogmatic adherence to ancient, unquestionable authority, and the elevation of faith, believing without evidence as a supreme virtue.
And yet, the text illustrates how terrified the scientific community is of stating this conflict out loud. The author paints a really vivid, almost surreal portrait of the 2006 Beyond Belief conference held at the Salk Institute.
Oh, this story is wild.
Right. Picture an auditorium filled with the absolute zenith of the scientific elite, Nobel-winning physicists, pioneering molecular biologists, world-renowned anthropologists. Yet, according to the author's account, this assembly of brilliant minds spent 3 days engaged in these bizarre intellectual contortions, utterly unable to reach a consensus on whether there was any conflict at all between science and religion.
The author describes the scene as profoundly disorienting. Many of these scientists were operating under the protective umbrella of NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria.
Right.
It's a concept championed by the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. The premise of NOMA is that science and religion possess entirely separate domains of teaching authority. Science is granted the magisterium of empirical facts and the physical mechanics of the universe, while religion is granted exclusive dominion over meaning, values, and moral instruction.
But based on the entire neurobiological framework, we just walk through the reality that values are simply facts about conscious well-being, which is dictated by the physical brain that division is a complete fiction.
It's totally artificial.
The text details how even openly atheist scientists at this conference would aggressively rush to defend religion. They argued that it is somehow indecent or uncivil to subject religious faith to the same rigorous critique applied to every other claim about reality.
Yeah.
They also remarks on how strange it was to watch these brilliant empiricists suddenly adopt the apologetic talking points of theologians the moment faith was challenged.
It really begs the question, what drives this deference? Why do individuals who demand rigorous evidence in the laboratory suddenly abandon their critical faculties when the topic shifts to religious belief?
What are they so afraid of?
Well, the text outlines several deeply pragmatic sociological fears driving this behavior. First, there's the raw economic reality. Scientists, particularly in the United States, harbor deep anxieties about losing their institutional funding if they are perceived by the public or by politicians as being openly hostile to mainstream religion.
The pressure of the grand cycle is very real.
It absolutely is. Second, there is a pervasive fear of triggering a massive public backlash that could damage the reputation of scientific institutions. And third, the author identifies the somewhat condescending paternalism within the scientific elite.
How so?
There is a lingering sentiment that while elite academics can navigate a stark secular universe devoid of a cosmic plan, the ignorant masses are too fragile. The assumption is that the average person requires pious delusions and the threat of divine punishment just to maintain social order and cope with existential dread.
And when we look at the financial incentives, the text specifically zeroes in on the influence of organizations like the Templeton Foundation. This is an entity with a massive $1.5 billion endowment, and its explicit mission is to fund efforts that synthesize science and religion, essentially trying to rebrand faith as a legitimate parallel arm of scientific inquiry.
Yep.
They inject massive amounts of capital into research grants, academic conferences, book prizes, all designed to blur the boundaries between hard science and theology, which the text argues effectively purchases the complicity of otherwise rigorous secular academics.
This creates an incredibly distorted public discourse. The text critiques the accommodationist strategy promoted by writers and scientists who argue that taking a combative stance against religion is tactically foolish.
So they want to rock the boat.
Right. The accommodationist view suggests that if scientists are too aggressive, they will alienate the religious public, making it impossible to teach concepts like evolution or climate change. Therefore, they argue, scientists must coddle religious sensibilities and pretend there is no conflict.
But the author counters that strategy with a vital question about intellectual honesty. Are we going to treat the public as rational adults capable of engaging with difficult truths? Or are we going to treat them as volatile children who must be shielded by polite fictions?
It's a great question.
If the scientific community is so intimidated by public opinion that it sacrifices its core commitment to intellectual honesty just to coax people into accepting basic biology, what has been lost in the process?
It is a damning critique of institutional cowardice. And to demonstrate exactly how this double standard operates at the highest echelons of the scientific establishment, the text provides a detailed case study regarding Francis Collins.
One of the most prominent geneticists in the world.
Exactly.
Francis Collins is a monumental figure in modern biology. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, and he authored a massively successful book titled The Language of God.
In this book, Collins makes a highly specific theological claim dressed up in scientific authority. He argues that human morality, specifically the moral law and the capacity for genuine altruism, the willingness to sacrifice one's own advantage for another, is entirely unique to the human species. Furthermore, he claims that this altruism completely defies all mechanisms of evolutionary biology. Therefore, Collins concludes, the existence of human morality serves as absolute, undeniable proof of a personal God who deliberately intervened in our cognitive development to instill this moral sense.
So how did the gatekeepers of science react to one of their own? making a claim that just bypasses evolutionary biology to prove a divine creator.
You would think they'd be critical.
You would. But the text notes that the journal Nature, which is arguably the most prestigious, influential scientific publication on the planet, reviewed Collins's book with glowing praise.
Wow.
They lauded his effort to build bridges between the ivory tower of academia and the religious heartland, treating his suspension of evolutionary principles as a noble, unifying gesture.
But if we applied the text framework and actually examine Collins's claim using empirical behavioral science, the argument shatters immediately. Is the capacity for altruism and moral behavior uniquely human? Does it actually defy evolutionary explanation?
The wealth of data from evolutionary biology and primatology says absolutely not.
Not even close. The biological record is saturated with evidence of moral precursors. We can observe kin selection and reciprocal altruism across mammalian species. The text highlights that mice exhibit measurable physiological distress when they observe familiar mice experiencing pain.
Empathy in mice.
Yes. In behavioral experiments, macaque monkeys will literally starve themselves for days to avoid pulling a chain that delivers a food reward to them, but simultaneously administers an electric shock to a cage mate.
That is incredible.
We see robust evidence in chimpanzees and even domesticated dogs demonstrating a clear, mathematically measurable sense of fairness and inequity aversion. If you train two dogs to perform a trick, and reward one but continually deny the reward to the other for the exact same effort, the shortchanged dog will visibly express frustration and cease cooperating.
They possess a fundamental neurological understanding of what is unfair.
They do. The building blocks of morality, altruism, and a sense of justice are not magical interventions. They're deeply embedded in our evolutionary lineage, driven by the survival benefits of social cohesion. Harris argues that for the head of the Human Genome Project to systematically ignore this vast, well-documented body of behavioral science in order to construct a theological argument is, from a strictly scientific perspective, deeply negligent.
And here's where it gets really interesting. To illustrate how institutional bias protects mainstream religion, the text contrasts the reception of Collins with another scientist, a biochemist named Rupert Sheldrake.
Right, Sheldrake.
Sheldrake proposed a highly speculative fringe theory called morphic resonance, which suggested that biological forms are shaped by a sort of hidden collective memory in nature.
It was definitely an unconventional theory that lacked empirical support, but it was fundamentally an attempt at formulating a naturalistic scientific hypothesis.
And how did the journal Nature respond to Sheldrake? They published a scathing editorial suggesting his book should literally be burned. They effectively decapitated his professional reputation. Yet, when Francis Collins publishes a book that ignores foundational evolutionary biology to argue that human altruism is proof of the Christian God, Nature publishes an editorial praising his vision.
The author uses this juxtaposition to expose a massive, deeply ingrained taboo within the scientific establishment. If a scientist attempted to integrate their empirical research with astrology or claim that their data was guided by the lost continent of Atlantis, they would be immediately, mercilessly exiled from the professional scientific community.
Obviously.
But because Collins is synthesizing his science with a mainstream socially dominant religion, he is shielded from critique and praised for his diplomacy. The argument is that the scientific community is actively, intentionally refusing to police the boundary between reasoned, evidence-based discourse and pious fiction, entirely out of a sociological fear of offending the dominant cultural religion.
It is a remarkable indictment of how cultural norms can warp objective inquiry. We have covered a tremendous expanse of intellectual territory today.
We really have.
We began by dismantling the centuries-old philosophical illusion that facts and values exist in separate dimensions, establishing the premise that human values are, at their core, biological facts about the well-being of conscious creatures.
We then visualize this reality by mapping the moral landscape, understanding that while there are multiple valid peaks of human flourishing, there are also objective, measurable valleys of human misery.
Yep.
We examine the neurobiology of belief, revealing how our brains process moral truths and factual truths using identical circuitry, and how our cultural environments physically rewrite our epigenetic code. Finally, we explored the urgent argument that the scientific community must stop retreating behind the shield of non-overlapping magisteria, cease accommodating dogmatic traditions, and step firmly and confidently into the moral conversation.
So as we synthesize all of this, the critical question is what this means for you, the listener. How does adopting this scientific framework alter the way you navigate the moral disputes in your own life?
That's the real takeaway.
If well-being is not just a hazy philosophical concept, but a tangible, measurable fact rooted in neurochemistry and physics, it implies that we do not have an obligation to endlessly respect or tolerate viewpoints that cause demonstrable, measurable harm. It provides a rational, evidence-based foundation to draw a line and say, the data shows that this practice diminishes human flourishing, and here is the biological and sociological proof.
It equips us with the analytical tools to demand better of our societies and ourselves, grounding our ethics in reality rather than tradition.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought experiment to mull over. Something that stretches the logic of everything we've unpacked today to its absolute breaking point.
Oh, I'm ready.
If we accept the premise that our highest moral peaks, our most profound feelings of love, meaning, empathy, and fulfillment are ultimately entirely determined by physical brain states and the precise balance of neurochemistry, what happens when human engineering inevitably invents perfect neural stimulation technology?
Wow. That is the ultimate philosophical trapdoor for this framework.
Right. Imagine a future where we create a flawless virtual simulation. You can plug your brain into this matrix, and the technology perfectly calibrates your neurochemistry to a sustained state of absolute peak well-being. Your oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin are optimized forever.
Sounds pretty good.
You experience the subjective sensation of saving the world, loving deeply, and achieving everything you ever wanted. But in physical reality, your body is just floating in a pod. You never perform a single tangible good deed in the real world ever again. If the conscious experience of well-being is the only thing that truly matters, as the text argues, would plugging the entire human race into the simulation be the ultimate, scientifically perfected moral triumph? Or does our intuition scream that a world of passive bliss is actually a dystopian valley?
It is a phenomenal question. It tests the very limits of how we define human flourishing, pushing us to ask if there is a fundamental difference between the subjective experience of well-being and the objective reality of our actions.
Definitely something for you to ponder the next time you are staring into that miraculous little slab of glass in your hand, wondering exactly what it's doing to your brain chemistry. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been a rigorous journey across the moral landscape, and we hope it has provided you with a powerful new lens for analyzing the world around you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Keep applying critical thought and keep asking the hard questions.
See you next time.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence, and also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium, and there are several blog posts there, and you can enjoy it, you can read it, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.